Thank you very much. We can cozy up here, you know. I have no infectious or communicable diseases, and I want to make sure we all hear each other. I'm here, my interest in this is not to talk at enormous length. I will tell you a few stories about how R2P came to be, but I'm most interested in getting into dialogue and discussion with you, and I look around the room and see a lot of students of mine who are, oh, I get a beer out of it. I see a lot of students who are gluttons for punishment because I teach them Mondays and Wednesdays, and they show up on Wednesday night, so I'm very touched by that, and welcome you all to be here, and thank Gillian Siskin, and also commend to you CLAIHR, C-L-A-I-H-R. It sounds like a kind of Welsh pronunciation of Claire, doesn't it? It's kind of slightly off. There's kind of one too many syllables in it. But it's a very good organization, and it's, if I can just say something in general about that we forget about our country, and it's very important. Canada has an absolutely extraordinary international reputation in relation to international law. If you think of Louise Arbour as the first prosecutor for the ICTY in Yugoslavia, think of Philippe Kirsch, you think of going back a generation, which you will perhaps be less aware of the crucial role of Canada in generating the international law of the sea. One of the places where Canada, since the Second World War, has, as to use that horrible cliche, has punched above its weight, is in the generation and creation of international law. And if you go right back and look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, who is the drafter of that document, if any single drafter can be identified? It's a McGill law professor called John Humphrey. These facts will be familiar to you, but I urge you, especially because some of you are hoping to become young lawyers and some of you are thinking of law school, do remember to think of your own career in terms of your country's greatest achievements and potential contribution in the future. We really do have, you have some very, very distinguished Canadians who have served to create such structures of international law as we have, and CLAIHR is an organization which embodies that vision of the law, that law is not just national, it's international, and some of the success that we have achieved in keeping barbarism from overwhelming us entirely is due to the hard work of Canadian lawyers. So that would be the first thing, and that helps me to situate R2P in a way, because one of the ways to think about R2P as an experience that I lived through is as an example of Canadian norm entrepreneurship. Those of you who've had a class inflicted on you already on this subject will be familiar with this idea. Law often starts as a norm. Law often starts simply as a principle, as a good idea. And it makes a slow and long transit from norm to emerging principle, that was Gillian Siskin's phrase for what R2P is, to customary state practice, to customary international law, and then potentially at some point statutory international law. There's a long historical process, and R2P is has gone from good idea to UN endorsed norm, and with Libya is emerging state practice, and you see how it goes. So we're in the middle of the road after 10 years, and that's a very important process. How did it start? My sense of how R2P started is really starts after Kosovo. The International Commission before R2P was an international commission sponsored by the Swedish government on the Kosovo intervention. Those of you will know that the Kosovo intervention achieved an important humanitarian goal, but it was achieved outside the authorization of the UN Security Council. And everybody came out of Kosovo thinking that there was a gap between legality and legitimacy. It was a legitimate intervention, but it wasn't a legal one. And nobody liked the idea of legality and legitimacy coming apart in international law. So the Swedish government stepped up and said, let's have a commission. It was chaired by Judge Goldstone of the South African Supreme Court. I served on that with Martha Minow of the Harvard Law School and a number of other distinguished figures. And we wrote a report that tried to solder legitimacy and legality back together. And that was the beginning. But we still had this separation between legality and legitimacy, and at that point, Canada stepped up. Lloyd Axworthy, then the Liberal foreign minister, who needs to be remembered for a real strategic genius in norm innovation, using the power of Canada to lead with ideas. It wasn't just R2P, as you're aware, it was also the landmines treaty. A government of Canada partnering with NGOs. What a scandal to get a landmines treaty through. So R2P is part of a pattern of norm entrepreneurship by an imaginative foreign minister and an imaginative government who saw that Canada can lead. Canada's leadership in ideas is one of the most important ways in which Canada can lead in the international community. Axworthy says, basically, to Kofi Annan, Kofi, I'll get you a report that fixes this humanitarian intervention problem and resolders legitimacy and legality together. Kofi says, I'd be glad to have the report. If I take the report, then it has official UN imprimatur. We're a little short of money. Lloyd Axworthy says, well, I happen to sit on the board of the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago. The MacArthur Foundation, private U.S. foundation of a great imaginativeness, it steps forward. The secretariat side of the R2P commission is provided by the government of Canada. I'm going through these details because this is how norm entrepreneurship gets put together. A government partners with a private foundation in another country, gets the UN to receive the report, and then you get people like me in to provide some ballast. They chose Mohammed Sanoun from the Global South and from the Islamic world, and they chose Gareth Evans, foreign minister of Australia, to chair the panel, and they got me in, plus a number of other Canadians, including Ramesh Thakur, plus some international, ex-president of the Philippines who smoked very long cigars, and a Russian guy who never showed up, but you know, the usual kind of international scene, and we toured the world, and touring the world was very important. Norm entrepreneurship will not work for Canada, for any other country, if you just stay in the global north. You've got to go to a lot of places for whom humanitarian intervention is simply a synonym for Western imperialism. You've got to go to Africa, countries that have fought for their independence, value their sovereignty immensely, are extremely worried about any change in the rules of global sovereignty that would make it easier for, Western countries to intervene in, or for strong states to intervene in weak states. You got to go to a place like India. We went to Delhi, and some of the crucial drafting of the report happened in a Delhi hotel. The only time I've ever been to India, I spent the entire time in a darkened room without any natural light, working on this darn report. So India is out there somewhere, but I didn't see it. None of us did. But you have to go to India because the Indians will say, look, we have a Gandhian, Nehruian foreign policy, and this stuff about intervening in other people's real estate is just poison to us. You have to understand that this is a global conversation in which there is deep, embedded historical disagreement about whether it is appropriate for states to intervene in other states. And it is a testimony to the success of R2P that we did forge a global consensus which, on the one hand, reinforces sovereignty, says the equality of sovereignty that weak and strong states possess in the international system is a crucial moral value. It's not only a strategic value, it's a moral value. On the other hand, sovereignty must entail, if you're given this international guarantee of inviolability, you must discharge minimum responsibilities to your population. You can't chop them into small pieces. You can't drive them across the frontier because of their race or ethnicity or religion. Very minimal stuff. We very deliberately did not make human rights observance the core of responsibility. We put the threshold way down low. Massacre, actual or apprehended. Ethnic cleansing, actual or apprehended. Genocidal killing, actual or apprehended. And we set that barrier for a very deliberate reason, so that we would not create an interventionist charter. So we would not back ourselves into a position in which human rights abuse or overthrow of a democratic government or some other things we could think about becomes the trigger for intervention. We set that trigger at actual or apprehended massacre and killing. And this way we were able to balance the principle of defending sovereignty and sovereign inviolability with a minimal and quite precise definition of what responsibility entails. We'd all like to have a more ambitious definition of sovereignty. We put it right down at the core, because that was the only way that we could sustain an international consensus on this. It's important to notice that when we did this, people forget this, we signed off on that report, and I wrote chunks of it, and Gareth Evans wrote chunks of it, and Mohammed Sanoun wrote chunks of it, and it was a lot of fun. Gareth Evans is big, burly Australian, screaming at you and arguing with you and saying he never heard a Canadian say a sensible thing in his life, and I was no exception. I mean, it wasn't, collegial thing. It was real hammer and tong stuff, but we achieved a rare moment of kind of peace, harmony in Wakefield, Quebec, where the final meeting of the commission was held. It was held on, I think, the 28th of August, 2001. We signed off, and I went up the hill to the burial spot right behind the Wakefield Inn in Quebec. And some of you may know who is buried up there, Mike Pearson. So for a Canadian, this was an emotional moment. A sense that we had been faithful to a great tradition. 10 days later, the planes plow into the World Trade Center. So understand, this is how history works. We were essentially facing backwards at Kosovo, trying to fix the legitimacy problem and salvage international humanitarian intervention. We were trying to solve a problem of the 90s, and suddenly, 10 days later, we were in the 21st century. And so immediately, R2P disappeared. We were in a new world. We had a new problem, and the problem was terrorism. And then it got worse. Iraq, nobody could see R2P as a justifying rationale for intervention in Iraq. It was a threat to international peace and security case, or it was not. There were either weapons of mass destruction there, or there were not. I was alive to the flagrant, grotesque, horrible human rights abuses that Saddam Hussein had committed, and I had done something to make those public, but I did not believe that those alone were a trigger for an invasion of Iraq. There had to be a credible threat to international peace and security, and I believed there was, and most of the world felt there wasn't. I was wrong, the world was right, but it didn't have anything to do with R2P. But history works in funny ways, and now we're in Libya, and suddenly R2P has returned, and it's returned in a very specific way. Literally the language of the UN Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force uses the rationale of protecting civilian populations from apprehended massacre. The trigger, as you remember, was not actual, but also apprehended massacre of civilian populations. And Libya, I think, does fit an R2P mandate. But remember also that R2P was not simply about when you trigger military intervention, it was also in a continuum of engagement that begins with prevention of conflict, reaction to actual or apprehended massacre, and then follow through. And now the dilemma we've got about R2P in relation to Libya is, what does the obligation to protect populations entail in terms of afterwards and rebuilding? What are we morally and strategically required to do in relation to Libya? I made a point in an article that you may have read on Saturday that one of the illusions that you could easily have when you've staged a successful military intervention using precision air power, which is essentially, Libya is a very close replay of Kosovo. One of the illusions that you can entertain when you do that is the feeling, well, we did it. We did this, right? And I have a very strong feeling that one of the things we have to understand is that we did not do this. The Libyan people did this, and they will control what happens here on out, and we have an ancillary and supportive role, but they have to define what it is that they want from us, and it should not, in my view, require ground troops, and it should not require the provision of security, and it should not require the permanent provision of air cover, and they've got to create their own society with a transitional government that moves to elections and moves to a constitution, yes, and gives us Sharia law in the constitution and everything they want to do. We may not like so much, but it's their country, it's not ours. One of the things I've come out of the whole R2P experience feeling is that one of the most seductive aspects of Western power is the ability to use air power at zero risk. It's lowered the threshold for interventions because the risk has been taken out of it because of the technology. And it is easy to imagine in 15, 20 years that we will have interventions with no human beings in the air. It's quite conceivable to imagine even close air support with drones. So the threshold of risk for engagement by Western military forces, NATO, the United States, and also Canada, will be zero. Just a lot of hardware you lose, but zero. So it's ever more important that we get clear about when we can engage, because the thresholds of engagement are going down, not up. And the risks of engagement are going down, not up, especially when you don't commit troops on the ground. Just a couple of concluding notes. The Harper government doesn't like to use this language because it's liberal language. This is the dumbest thing you ever heard. This was a Canadian agenda. It doesn't have a liberal label on it. Just ridiculous politics. The fact that Lloyd Axworthy was in on it and I was in on it just doesn't have anything to do with anything. It was a good Canadian idea and should be defended and maintained as such. The final point I would make, and then I've gone on longer than I intended, and my wife is looking at me with that thing that wives do, which is where do we go from here? What is R2P? It was a good idea that was delivered to the United Nations. Resolutions based on it were promoted through the UN General Assembly by the Government of Canada in 2005. But it is a kind of orphaned good idea, a good idea that may not get into customary international law or into black letter law until civil society, the Canadian government, and other governments engage with it, defend it, and promote it in the kind of global dialogue about what sovereign responsibility should be that we need. This thing will not become part of the fabric of international law unless we are part of a process that makes it so. And that's why I'm so glad to see you here, and I'm happy to take your questions.